All right, so I want to jump right into ducts that we're putting into our homes. We've got a few different varieties of ductwork, and as a builder, I am tasked with putting the ductwork in a home that is going to last long and provide good indoor air quality, high performance of the HVAC. But I'm also having to balance stuff like budget and clients and client expectations, you name it, right? So there's just so many different directions that this conversation goes when we're selecting ductwork. And so I did have John recently do some duct design on one of the projects that we're working on that we're actually into right now. And in that particular project, something that came to light very quickly was that we had an opportunity with plenums to do plenums out of a fiberboard or metal. And the ceiling in this particular project for the first floor ceiling is not accessible. So therefore, it's going to be problematic to whoever potentially lives there down the road if some of this ductwork needs to be changed out or if there's problems cleaning it. And it led to this really good conversation that brought me to y'all guys to have this exercise here of how to make some of these choices, because we're always balancing finances and the expectations, all the things that I mentioned earlier. And it gets to be really tricky. So the last thing I want to do is put something in somebody's ceiling that they're going to have to take out and mess up the ceiling, right? That sounds kind of crazy. But at the same time, I don't want to charge somebody an arm and a leg when they're looking at the big picture and not hyper-focused on the HVAC. So, I do my best, and I talk with folks like y'all who are very educated in this department. But I wanted to get the take from each of y'all in order to help educate others out there on how the heck we make these decisions and which ones are the most important and just kind of how to think about some of these things. So let's jump into the fiberboard, right? And let's just talk about fiberboard, the plenums and ductwork for a moment, and then we can go into some of the other forms of duct materials that we have. But Sean, why don't you jump in and start with the fiberboard?
Yeah, so fiberboard is made out of fiberglass, and fiberglass is a respiratory irritant. It can cause cancer, so something we want to keep out of the airstream, which is kind of ironic because we actually put it in our airstream, which is frustrating from an indoor air quality perspective. That means that care has to be used. It has to be done to make sure that those fibers, that loose fiberglass, when you're cutting that, is not just laying down and sort of in the airstream as it is. The fiberboard has an exterior air liner, so there's a foil air liner on the outside. Then it's made up of this porous, fibrous material, fiberglass inside, and that's what makes up its insulation, is the air gap that creates. So then, on top of that, you've got a resin-coated layer that's supposed to help keep those fibers down and keep that from becoming airborne. So that's sort of the makeup of it. There's a lot to it that's going to be a problem, right? So we're talking about it being a sponge. So when water jumps off the coil onto that surface, we're going to have water that soaks into that sponge and then take a long time for that to dry. In our hot, humid climate, because keep in mind this is all climate specific, in our humid climate, cold surfaces are wet surfaces, and our ductwork is the coldest surface we have. So it's going to be a wet surface most of the time, and those drops that fly off of the coil are going to be wet and take a long time to dry. Those areas are going to stay wet, and when that happens, chances for mold are highly likely. So we have to consider that, and it's not cleanable. If we get mold inside there, it's not a cleanable thing. That's a replacement thing. It's a porous item. We don't want to be trying to clean those places. And then stirring up the fiberglass and all of that. So there's a lot of downsides to ductboard. Some of the more positive things are it's really easy to work with. People in the field can really modify it and adjust it and make things in the field a whole lot easier and quicker than with metal. It's a cheaper product because it's easier to use and easier to install. When we're talking about metal, you got to cut the metal is unforgiving, and then you have to wrap it with the insulation. The wrapping of the insulation is actually kind of expensive and also hard to get right on metal, so it's more time consuming, whereas the ductboard is all in one, the air barrier and the insulation. Another issue is rodents. Depending on what your air barrier looks like and how easily accessible your attic is to rodents and things, they really like chewing on that stuff, and you get a bunch of rodents inside the ductwork from them chewing on it, so it's not good.
Yeah, full disclosure, guys, I have at my house a big old piece of ductboard that is near the area where my attic access is, and it's walkable in there, but you have to kind of leap over this, and so over the years, that thing has been crushed, and it's super embarrassing. And it's basically all those things that you're talking about. And then my attic definitely has had rodents in it before, so we are definitely due to make some changes at my house. But the reason I wanted to share that with y'all is because I want y'all to understand that normal people live with ductboard all the time, and we're not dead necessarily from it, right? We're not necessarily having health problems like my health. That hasn't felt like it's impacted. All that said, it doesn't seem smart. It doesn't seem that logical. So, you know, I see a few of the pros and cons. John, from the install perspective, why don't you share just a few of the pros and cons of the ductboard with us real quick?
So let's all start off in the beginning where we say the definitions and what ductboard is. Just to be really frank with builders and everyone, it is the least cost way I can do something to pass code. And it kind of sucks to hear that. You know, it's when you think about that, that is everything down the line. That is going to be the least expensive installer. That is going to be the least expensive, how would you say, just person that seals it up, because everybody's trying to hit that budget. So that's one of the,
So it's very budget geared.
it's budget geared. Yeah. It's budget geared. So as an install standpoint, so everybody, when we say plenums, that is the air distribution box where everything comes off of the equipment.
Yeah, let me show y'all what a plenum is, right? So John actually did this design for me for our Chalet Clovet project. And so these squares and rectangles, if I'm not mistaken, are going to be our plenums. And then all those branches off of those are our ducts. So the plenums are those big rectangles. Right?
And the idea of a plenum is this box is supposed to pressurize, and then the airflow goes down each duct consistently. So in other words, if you were to put ducts on the end of this plenum, for example, there would be no pressurization, and all the airflow would go down the end of that duct run. You want all of these duct runs to have an equal chance at getting airflow, and then the airflow is determined by the dampers or duct sizing that's on the plenum. So
and people got to understand out there, airflow is lazy and dumb. So we have to control it with certain measures, of course, pressurization, but just the simple fact of using dampers. So going back on kind of understanding as an installer, the two types of ducts we have a trunk and branch system, whether it can be metal or fiberglass, but most plenums are kind of a trunk. We also have a radial approach or a hybrid approach where it takes all the flex and sends it to what we call our little buckets, which pushes air into the rooms. But on the pros of fiberboard, which there's very little, it is primarily used in the South and not really used in the North. So most Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, south of Texas, climate zone 2, what we say, we're mostly using that type of material. And we're also putting it in the dumbest place, guys, in an unconditioned attic. So there's a lot of things that happen.
Like my attic is right now that we're actually transforming.
Yep.
Yeah.
So not only having the cheapest material and probably not your most skilled installer, you're going to have chances where it's weak insulation values from our knives cutting in there or making on-field adjustments or transitions. Also the leakage, you know, it's sometimes when we're doing these extended trunks, we don't have screws holding that material together. It's actually just tape sealing around it. So there's a lot of bad things on it, but the pros is, hey, for budget conscious builders and homeowners that are budget conscious, it's going to go. It's going to do its job. Okay, it's going to get air from point A to point B.
It's going to make me and my family warmer and cool like it is right now at our house. And again, we're all alive, we're all happy and seem healthy.
Yep.
So I will say it doesn't seem like it necessarily has anything catastrophic. What are some of the ways that, and I have some clues of this, but what are some of the ways, guys, that you can make the ductboard safer to experience in your home?
Well, I'll go first with this because there's sometimes we on the boots, and just to be clear, guys, there's fiberglass. If you got an all metal ductwork system, guess what's inside that machine? Fiberglass.
And what part of the machine would you mean?
It's going to be in the air handler box inside of the actual furnace or our cooling coil.
Oh, I had no idea.
Now, sometimes they flip the fiberglass where it's the metal part, as Sean was explaining earlier, what's on the outside of fiberboard.
Right.
You know, but there's fiberglass in there.
Interesting.
You know, so there is things that are you're not going to be 100% perfect for these health sensitive clients. We're going to get as best we can. Okay. Now, when I'm coming to an area where I have, let's say, a 2-story home where I cannot get to the ductwork that's in the subfloor area, if I'm exposed with a bucket or boot and the homeowner does not want to cut sheetrock, we will seal the inner liners or the inner side of that boot with actual mastic or sealant, or the term pookie inside of our industry. And it's just a sealant that goes on and it seals up those surfaces so they lock in.
Is that something that you offer?
So they also make encapsulant paints that can be sprayed applied, and those provide a nice even coating. They have natural antimicrobial properties to them. They are sort of a rubberized coating similar to mastic, but more appropriate for, like mastic is more for duct sealing, whereas this is specifically the product to use that you could go in and spray a plenum after you install the plenum. You could then spray this coating on there, and that's going to help with the sponginess of it and keeping everything on the surface. So if a water droplet comes off the coil, it's going to have a chance to re-evaporate as opposed to sinking into that sponge.
So there are some solutions. And another place I was kind of headed with it was the placement of the air filter, right? So that could be pretty significant in trying to minimize the amount of fiberglass that comes into the living space. Is that accurate?
Yes, I've seen people do combination of certain materials, duct materials, of like fiberglass, where it comes from the return, it's sucking in, it's a low cost, and then it hits the filter, and then from that filter it transitions to metal. Right. So you'll catch everything at the filter, and then boom, metal, and then you could go metal plenums and flex.
Right.
More
Is that a decent approach, or are we still kind of are we still introducing a problem into the design when we act that way?
So a lot of these things are not black and white, as with life, I guess. But we want to understand what the goals are, and then make sure that our budget can meet those goals. And so if we're trying to be very budget conscious, the most important thing would be having a metal supply plenum, because that's going to be the coldest surface, the wettest surface. Everything else would be nice. It'd be nice to have a strong, you can be able to climb over your return plenum without it collapsing, like you mentioned in your attic. So yeah, and then also you have to think about filter bypass, how often you're changing those filters. Is you're putting in the right size filter so that those fibers aren't going through the system anyway. But yeah, having a media filter is really helpful to stop anything downstream of that.
Okay, so it's something to keep in mind with the fiberboard is that you can theoretically catch it with the filter before it gets reintroduced back into your living space. So that could help you out a lot in theory, right?
Yes, yes. Okay. And just accessible, a 2-story home where you're having your main return where all of the air is coming up and you're never going to get to that. Well, that return air chamber and duct is going to collect dust. So it's going to collect dust till it hits that filter. And that's where cleaning it and stuff like that might happen. But me and my own personal feelings, how I feel with fiberboard, it's almost impossible to clean. Because that thin layer Sean was talking about, it is, I could push my fingers together. That's how thin it is.
Yeah.
And once the Brussels or something brushes against it, how are we going to hold the integrity? Or Sean, I can ask, how do you hold the integrity in that fiberboard when you're cleaning it?
Yeah, so I also provide duct cleaning, and I'm NADCA certified, NADCA trained, which is the National Air Duct Cleaning Association. They have standards in place for how you clean things. And so duct board is supposed to be contact vacuumed. So you take a vacuum with a HEPA filter and you brush, and you're brushing the top of a sponge, basically. So the dust, the mold, the whatever, and it's very time consuming, and you just have to go in and brush the whole thing out. And it's not very effective either, because we were doing it on a sponge, right? All the stuff is still in there. So you cut into it, yeah. So wherever it's accessible anyway, obviously if it's in between floors, then that's a problem. But we typically go in through the filter door. We typically cut.
It sounds like a surgery, like arthroscopic surgery or something.
Yeah, no, it's actually not even equivalent to that, because we're cutting huge holes in the ductwork to allow proper access for proper cleaning, and then we're patching those back up appropriately. It's it's not like I'm going in there with just one small hole. I really want to get this thing clean. I want to do it the correct way,
so
and that means
scrubbing. And then you said you can introduce liquids or something to that effect. Is that right?
Well, yeah. So if someone was interested in getting rid of the fibers that could be in the air, then we would do a clean and encapsulate. So we would contact vacuum the plenums.
Is it doable to get rid of the fibers that could be in the air in ductboard?
It's nothing is ever 100%, but if you clean it and then you encapsulate the whole thing in this encapsulant paint, then you have a shot at really significantly.
So you can definitely improve it.
Yeah.
Okay, even the ductboard. And so like at my house, if I called you over there and I wanted to just keep leaning on this old HVAC equipment and ductwork that I have, there are some approaches that I could actually take to improve the indoor air quality.
There is, and it would be an improvement, just not 100%. And this isn't a recommendation to encapsulate over mold or anything like that. Right. This is mainly for fiber control.
And then I just want to say with that, I think access is very critical, right?
Yeah.
And goes back to the client and the project that we're working on within the duct design. And just looking up at the ceiling right here and thinking, man, that's such a look at the ceiling, guys. It's a pretty ceiling, right?
Yeah.
So that's typically how the ceilings in my projects look. So yeah, I don't.
That's that white glove where you got to hang
That's
those
right.
grills with the white glove.
So I don't typically want to have to go cut into that to be able to access said ductboard and go do all the cleaning and all that. And so I guess theoretically you could have some access points or something that ultimately I think would end up looking pretty weird and like you had Swiss cheese in your ceiling. So I don't think that's super realistic. So back to the scenario there. Am I making a mistake if I put a ductboard plenum in the ceiling? Is that a mistake?
I would say it's the decision you're making. Am I making a 15 to 25 year decision, or am I making a decision like I'm thinking of the framing of the house? Do I want it to last forever?
Right.
And more questions to ask are, how well are you going to maintain this home? Are you going to be monitoring its humidity? In our climate, are you going to be putting a dehumidifier in that can keep this ductwork dry, a whole home dehumidifier?
We are in this particular one, but yes.
Awesome.
Okay.
So, the risk of having problems in your ductwork comes down to how well you're going to maintain and what the likelihood is that there's going to be condensing surfaces or the high dust events inside the home, things like that.
Right.
So staying on top of your dust, like if you're cutting sheetrock, for example, build a containment, use HEPA filters, things like that. If you're concerned about humidity, log your humidity and then put in a dehumidifier if it's high so that you can reduce that. So.
I like that. I think that makes me feel like it is possible to do it. I totally want to be as forthright as possible with clients and explain the pros and cons. But at the same time, I don't want to always push my own bias on them, even if I have the best of intentions with it. So I think it's kind of that fine line, but that does give me some good options to work with in terms of, okay, if we were going to make that decision for whatever reason, we really need to stay up on the filtration. It sounds like a media filter is going to be the right fit in most of these situations. And then the dehumidifier is going to help a lot, which helps with many things, even VOCs and stuff like that. So cool.